Good morning, everyone. I think we will get started for this morning. I think some people are still grabbing some coffee. Welcome back to those who are returning for day 2 of Psychosocial Transformations. And I think I see a few new faces, so welcome to the room. We're going to start with York University's land acknowledgement. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Welcome once again to day 2 of this Transformations Conference. I hope you all feel energized from the talks yesterday and also had a fantastic night in Toronto, wherever that took you, and that you feel well rested for another day of fantastic talks. Before we get started this morning, I'd like to welcome former provost, and now senior policy advisor to the president, Lisa Phillips, to provide some welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and good morning, everybody. Bonjour, buongiorno, buongiorne. Warm welcome to York University for day 2 of this incredible conference on psychosocial transformations. And I can still feel the energy from yesterday, even though I wasn't here yesterday. And I'm really honored to be asked to and be given the opportunity to say a few words about Deborah Britzman, Dr. Britzman. I have so enjoyed, first of all, reading all the abstracts for this conference. It was a delight. This promises, I know, to be a second day of immersive engagement and playful interaction with what some of you have called Britzmanology. I just love that. And Dr. Britzman is, of course, Emeritus Professor in York's Faculty of Education, York Research Chair in Pedagogy and Psychosocial Transformation, Distinguished Research Professor and Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And she is this highly decorated for good reason. It's hard to find the words to express, right, the breadth and impact of Deborah's scholarly career thus far. But, in trying to reach for those words, the kind of words that came to mind were sparkling and prolific and globally relevant and endlessly generative and generous and profoundly and widely influential. And the enormous intellectual reach and contribution that she's made to theory and scholarship is manifested also in just the sheer numbers, not just of publications, but of citations, of keynotes, of residencies, of book reviews, of the languages that her work has been translated into, for instance, and to in the countless numbers of scholars who go back again and again to her work for inspiration. We are extremely fortunate, Deborah, that you chose to make the bulk of your career here at York University. And you have had an incredibly positive impact on making York a major center for theoretical work, with a focus on psychoanalysis, but spanning multiple fields of education, gender and sexuality, social and political thought. And I want to say also that it's not always that theory in the academy comes with warmth and humanity. Do you find that? But in this case, it does. And you not only theorize it, but you really live it, and you really bring it to your interactions with students and colleagues. And I think that is why you have also had such a positive impact on building community, building intellectual community, social community, and those are very, very good things in their own right that have made York a better place. So thank you for that. And it's just delightful to see all of you here at York today to further build on this and stretch it in new directions and continue to make this one of the places in the academy that is really thriving and fun and important and interesting. So thanks for being here and for your participation as well. And with that, I will no longer stand in the way of getting on with the conference. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Lisa. So I want to start just by echoing Jen's comments from yesterday, our MC, by thanking all of you who are in the room, who have come to share your fine work at this event. And I will also say that yesterday I noticed that many of you were graciously thanking the organizers of the event, me, Jen, Aziz, and James, our wonderful RA. And I want to just also say that this could only be possible because of your participation in the event. So it is reciprocal. We really, really appreciate and feel very lucky, actually, that so many of you said yes. It was actually a problem of everyone said yes. And so this says something also, I think, about Britzman. And so despite some of the wrinkles about what it means to plan something at York, this was a very easy event in a way. So I thank you for the thanks, but it goes right back to you. I will be the MC for today. I'm a little bit more neurotic in my style, but I know this is a friendly room. So I'll do my best, but I don't think I'll make you laugh as hard. But I will be me. So today we are going to hear from 3 more panels, and each one of these reflects one of the conference themes. They will be on the school, the clinic, and the archive. And we'll conclude the day with an interactive cafe, which features great thinkers in each of these areas who will help us reflect on some of the big ideas that we've been taking up over the course of the last 2 days, and also help us consider some of the questions that still remain. So with that, I think we can start with the first panel, and I welcome Suad Ahmed, who's going to be chairing the education panel.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our panel discussion on psychosocial studies in education. We have 3 wonderful speakers sharing their work with us today. We have Karen Sandloz, who will discuss learning from loss, pedagogies of art, creativity, and transformation. We also have Janet Miller and Patty Lather to discuss Camp Brits. And finally, Paulo Borquez to discuss the digital commonplace book, Reframing Reading as a Practice of Implication. Karen Sandloz is Associate Professor of Art and founding head of the Art Education Program at the University of Illinois Chicago. Her research explores the role of interiority in educational and aesthetic experience and the pedagogical work of dream life. A recent graduate of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, Sandloz maintains a small clinical practice. Janet L. Miller, Professor Emerita, Teachers College, Columbia University, and Faculty at Large, Columbia University, founding managing editor of the JCT Journal of Education, Curriculum Theorizing, ERA Fellow, the Curriculum and Pedagogy Project's Lifetime Impact Award, ERA Division B Curriculum Studies Lifetime Achievement Award, former Vice President, ERA Division B, and former President of the American Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies. Patty Lather is Professor Emerita in Education at Ohio State University, where she taught qualitative research and feminist methodology from 1988 to 2014. She is the author of 5 books, the most recent being Post-Critical Methodologies, published in 2017. She's a 2009 inductee of the ERA Fellows and a 2010 recipient of the ERA Division B Lifetime Achievement Award. And finally, Paulo Borquez is Assistant Professor in the teaching stream and Professor of Writing and Rhetoric and Director of the Academic Writing Center at Woodworth's College, University of Toronto. Her current pedagogical research centers reading as a technology of rhetorical invention and self-transformation. She's the co-editor with Veronica Goriboto of the collection on psychoanalysis as social and political discourses in Latin America and the Caribbean. So just a reminder, we will be saving our questions and discussions until the end of the session today. And at this time, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Karen Sandloz. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aziz. Yeah. It's open, so you just need to. Good morning. Ooh. All right. Well, maybe we're all awake now. How's everyone feeling? Good? Good. I'm so happy to be here with all of you at this Britzman Palooza that we're having, and really honored to be invited to be part of this conversation. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Aziz. Thank you to the grad students. Thank you, Alice. You've been there the entire time, and your influence has been profound. So before I give my presentation this morning, I want to tell a quick story about Deborah. It was hard to pick just one. I first met Deborah around the mid to late 1990s. I had just completed my master's degree in sociology and equity studies and education at OISE U of T, and I was going straight into the doctoral program. And I really wanted to think about how learning occurs through encounters with art and film. And I was struggling to think about that. I knew that something was missing. And so, like many people here, I took Britzman's Pedagogy and Social Difference class as a visiting student. And in that class, I was introduced to the idea that education is an emotional situation and a space of psychical relation. And around that time, I was also doing a lot of work with a underground artist-run organization, a film and video festival called the Images Festival, which was tiny at the time and now has an international profile. And so this is my memory of a conversation we had, Deborah. I asked Deborah, do you think I could pursue doctoral research about small budget experimental films that no one's ever heard of and hardly anyone has ever seen? And do you think I could bring those into teacher education and then just, study what happens? And Deborah laughed and then said something like, sure, why not? And that is your project. So I felt both like something was possible and that she was taking my wild aspirational idea seriously at the same time. I transferred to York the following year. It was Deborah who challenged me to think about loss and breakdown as the grounds for creativity and repair. It's taken me a long time to think about that, and it's a lesson I'm still learning. For so many of us, it is thanks to Deborah that imagining interiority as the grounds of a humanizing education is both possible and utterly necessary. So the title of my paper is Learning from Loss, Pedagogies of Art, Creativity, and Transformation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, discussions about learning loss took center stage, highlighting gaps in students' knowledge and missed learning opportunities. Learning loss is not a new term for education. Before the pandemic, it was commonly used to describe the decline in academic mastery that students experience over the summer months. In the pandemic context, learning loss has now come to encompass two pressing educational challenges: student achievement and mental health. As the educational philosopher Barbara Stengel notes, learning loss is a primary concern, and the solutions offered are generally unimaginative. So with that in mind, my aim is to reframe the narrative around learning loss through psychoanalytic concepts of loss and mourning, fostering, I hope, a necessary dialogue about the humanizing potential of creativity and transformation in the face of loss. I'm particularly interested in how loss and mourning are experienced and symbolized in three contexts: the classroom, the psychoanalytic clinic, and contemporary art practice. So the broad questions that I am thinking about lately are, how do we mourn our losses in education? And what would it mean to recognize loss and mourning as features of learning? What can we learn from artists about the creative and collaborative dimensions of loss and mourning? And how might we juxtapose insights from contemporary art and psychoanalysis with narratives of classroom life? And I'm going to attempt one such juxtaposition today. My thinking about the creative dimensions of loss and mourning takes an indirect route back to education, using concepts from the psychoanalytic clinic as tools for exploring the emotional and relational complexities of learning in classroom life. Psychoanalytic approaches to education shift the focus away from those familiar discourses of learning outcomes and professional competencies to take the side of what Britzman has termed the emotional situation of human incompleteness. Britzman's emphasis on interiority suggests there is something more to learning than linearity or predictable outcomes. For Britzman, the anxiety of incompleteness, at once an obstacle to and a resource for development, sets the stage for learning to imagine what is missing or unknowable. One place where people learn to imagine what is missing or unknowable is in clinical therapy. In contemporary therapeutic approaches, however, responses to loss and mourning often prioritize what are called solution-focused approaches, such as short-term therapy and the use of antidepressant medication. As the psychoanalyst Darian Leader points out, mourning is equated with getting over a loss, rather than with understanding how experiences of loss shape our lives, often in ways that escape our immediate awareness. Leader continues, and this is a longer quote, so I thought we could look at it together. The cliche that losses need to be worked through so that we can move beyond them suggests that mourning is something that can be done and dusted. We are encouraged so often to get over a loss, yet bereaved people and those who have experienced tragic losses know full well that it is less a question of getting over a loss and on with life than finding a way to make that loss a part of one's life. Living with loss is what matters, and writers and artists show us the many different ways in which this can be done. Leader's description of mourning is useful because it turns our attention to the human capacity for creative agency in transforming the pain of loss into new and meaningful connections. As Leader argues, when we mourn a loss, it isn't just our thoughts about the lost loved one that count, but what we do with them, how they are organized, arranged, run through, altered. Leader describes mourning as a process of thinking through loss. And for Leader, this necessitates two moves, one external and one internal. First, we must recognize that life still has something to offer. This is the external move. Second, the absence must be registered internally, or as Leader states, inscribed indelibly into our mental lives. Mourning involves a particular kind of learning. We learn to symbolize what is no longer present. The lost object becomes a new internal object in absentia. This process of internalization is complex and difficult, yet it is also generative. If we can navigate it, it can lead to new thoughts and new psychological relations. To better understand how this process unfolds in the mind, we can look to the creative strategies and modes of expression found in contemporary art practice. The artist that I want to spend a bit of time with today is Chicago-based visual and performance artist Nick Cave. Okay. In a short documentary film for Art21, Cave talks about how he got started on his biggest and most sustained project to date, his sound suit project. This is the story he tells. The year was 1992, and Cave sat alone on a park bench, his thoughts focused on a shocking event, the recent savage beating of an African-American man named Rodney King by police officers in Los Angeles and the protests that followed. This was a time before cell phones, but the incident had been documented on a camcorder by a man named George Holliday and broadcast widely. Sitting on that park bench, eyes downcast, Cave asked himself this question: what does it feel like to be discarded, profiled, dismissed? He recalls, there was this twig on the ground, and I looked at that twig as something discarded. And then I proceeded to just start collecting the twigs in the park. And then I brought them all back to the studio, and I started to build this sculpture. Cave, an artist whose work combines sculpture, fashion design, and dance, noticed the sound the twigs made when he put on the suit and began moving around. For Cave, this was the moment the significance of the work emerged. I was building this suit of armor, he realized, something that I could shield myself against the world and society. Over 3 decades later, Nick Cave's Sound Suit series comprises over 50 wearable sculptures and has exhibited internationally in galleries and public performances. Nick Cave's sound suits are monumental in stature and pretty spectacular to behold. They are made from a wide range of materials, from twigs to beads, from fabric to fur, from buttons to sequins. Cave chooses his materials intuitively, often while wandering around flea markets and antique shops in Southwest Michigan. "I don't have a list," he remarks. Instead, the artist allows his mind and eye to wander, identifying an object that will become the instigator, as he puts it, a provocation, if you will, something that might spark a new direction for the next sound suit. Visually, the suits resist easy categorization. They could be monsters or aliens or hybrid creatures, both human and animal. At once other and playful, the sound suits invite the viewer to imagine alternative scenarios, selves, and even worlds. So what can we say about Nick Cave's artistic process as a process of mourning? For the artist, there is a moment of paying attention, of reorienting, of noticing objects, the twigs on the ground. Then the artist collects materials, assembles things in relation to other things, and this is not unlike what we sometimes do when we go through the process of mourning a lost loved one. We go through stuff. In the art-making process and in the artwork itself, there is an ambiguity, an interplay between what is real and what is imaginary. This ambiguity is crucial both to art-making and to the mourning process, an effect of what Darian Leader calls the play between internalization and externalization. According to Leader, symbolizing a loss is a necessary part of being able to start thinking about it. If things go well, not only is the loss registered or inscribed internally, it's also transformed by the mourner into a message to be conveyed externally to someone else, a therapist, an audience, a family member, or a community. In the fall of 2021, as in-person instruction resumed in schools and universities across Chicago, Nick Cave had a solo exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art. Many school groups visited the exhibition. I took my class, and numerous Chicago public school students engaged in sound suit design projects in their art classes. This is one example of a sound suit design that was created by a student teacher named Alex O'Neill. So in these projects, students were invited to imagine something they would need protection from, and then to think about how would they design a sound suit using different kinds of materials and aesthetic strategies to give themselves the kind of protection that they needed. Through these experiences, students not only learned about the concepts behind Nick Cave's work, but also explored his creative process, how he interacts with materials, the significance of sound in the work, and more. My impression is that the Sound Suit Project had a role to play in shaping cultural and educational conversations in Chicago during that very challenging year when we were all headed back to class in person and a sense of loss was so palpable and present. I can't know or say this for certain, but as many of us delve deeply into Nick Cave's work, paying close attention to the details of his creative process, we may have moved a little closer to what the psychoanalyst and artist Meg Harris-Williams describes as thinking with a work of art, rather than merely thinking or speaking about it. For Harris-Williams, thinking with a work of art involves a dynamic interplay of internalization and externalization, but not with the goal of arriving at a definitive interpretation of a finished artwork. As she notes, artists and writers not only create works of art, they also, as she puts it, exemplify the process of symbol formation. Now I want to apply this concept of thinking with a work of art to a pedagogical scene, one that also took place during that anxious year in 2021. This is my memory of it. I was visiting a high school art classroom. I was there to observe a student teacher who was conducting an introductory lesson on photography. The students were analyzing photos that they had taken on their cell phones, learning about the rule of thirds, and discussing how best to position the subject within the frame of the photograph. The classroom was lively and interactive, with engaged students chatting and moving around the room, while the student teacher stood nervously at the front of the room next to the smartboard. I was taking notes, while internally I was checking off the competency boxes on the state-mandated evaluation form I knew I was going to have to fill out later. Keenly aware that I had 11 other student teachers yet to observe, I reassured myself, everything is going just fine here. Well, class ended and I began our debrief, our discussion, by telling the student teacher that her lesson was in great shape. It was well planned and organized, and I could see the scaffolding that she had built in. And then I offered one suggestion. She needed to assert herself more in the classroom. I encouraged the student teacher to just move around the room, project your voice so the students can hear you, and just try to take up more space. As I spoke, I noticed the student teacher's expression starting to crumple behind her mask. She was in tears. The mentor teacher who was sitting with us got up from her chair, embraced the student teacher, and started saying things like, "You're okay. It's okay. You're going to be okay." We sat in that moment for a while. Eventually, I asked the student teacher, what had happened? What was going on for her? Can we talk about it? She apologized, saying something like, "I'm sorry, I'm just not good with feedback." I sensed that the conversation had reached its end. So after a few moments, the student teacher composed herself and offered to walk me out of the school. We rode the elevator down 3 floors together in silence. See you in class. So a few days later, back in class, we're gathered for the weekly student teaching seminar. Since the class was meeting in person again, a process that felt awkward and messy and hard in 2021, I had set up an activity to provide a containing structure for the class discussion. We called it Hot Mess. Each week, I invited the students to form a circle in the middle of the room. No desks, no laptops or phones, just a circle of chairs and people sitting in them. Each week, I would ask if anyone wanted to share a hot mess scenario from school, and students took turns discussing situations they had found challenging or uncertain. There was a lot to talk about. To my surprise, that week, the student teacher raised her hand and said something like, "I was the hot mess in student teaching this week. During my observation, I had a total meltdown. I was just standing there at the front of the class talking in a monotone." There was a long pause, and then she added, "The thing is, I learned not to present in a monotone in my university classes, but when I started student teaching, I reverted back to it. So now I have to learn that again." After a long silence, her best friend in the cohort chimed in, "You're kind of speaking in a monotone right now." Everyone laughed. And this time the student teacher could tolerate the feedback and even laughed a little herself. The student teacher's narrative captures a painful yet to be symbolized experience of learning to teach. Initially, she is stuck in one place at the front of the classroom, not yet able to reflect on or articulate her experience. In her second telling, during the seminar, a notable shift occurs. She expresses a desire to free herself from the rigid confines of a monotone, while simultaneously speaking in a monotone and grappling with her frustration over this limitation. 2 key points emerge from the second telling. The story reflects the student teacher's defensive maneuvers, likely motivated, I imagine, by a fear of falling apart in front of the class. The second telling is also aspirational, albeit full of frustration. She will have to learn it again. This nuanced expression is an example, perhaps, of what the psychoanalyst Marion Tolpin referred to as the trailing edge of human development, entwined with a fragile tendril of something creative, a forward edge, as Tolpin called it, a healthy striving. This double movement marked a pivotal moment for the student teacher, at once regressive and remobilizing. As Tolpin notes, and I quote, "It is this bit by bit and over again process that is the basis for expansion, integration, transformation, and stabilization of healthy aspects of the self into an altered psychical reality." A point worth emphasizing here is that symbolizing loss gets things moving again. In this case, a stuck student teacher was able to re-engage with her own learning. In Tolpin's view, however, these forward moves, entangled as they are with the trailing edges of development, are subtle and easily overlooked. While it's tempting to want to focus solely on the student-teacher's experience, I want to say a word about my own role in the pedagogical relation, namely what I was unable to notice or listen to because of what I had been trained to look for. The student-teacher was deeply unsettled by my invitation that she try to take up more space in the classroom. Although I intended it as a helpful piece of advice, she felt it as a provocation. For my part, it took an inner grasping for me to see that there was something more going on. The advice I gave the student teacher inadvertently disclosed or suggested the way she had enclosed herself within lesson plans and housed herself in educational scaffolding, which she had, as I put it to her at the time, built into her teaching. Fixed in her position next to that strange architecture known as the classroom smartboard, she had dressed herself, in a sense, in a monotone sound suit. In closing, what does the juxtaposition between Nick Cave's sound suit series and a classroom scene of student teaching reveal? In my view, this juxtaposition serves as an interpretive framework that is both capacious and entangled. It highlights how the subtle provocations we draw on internally and symbolically can illuminate the human condition of incompleteness in our work. The delicate tendrils of creativity, along with the unique sonic resonances of subjective movement in relation to loss, come slowly. This transformation is recursive and unpredictable. Encountering loss creatively and symbolically, rather than as an encrypted presence, can be destabilizing. Yet it also has the potential to guide us toward new forms of synthesis or coherence. In the classroom, making space for these fragile tendrils of creativity may require embracing strange and estranging symbolizations of experience. Just as contemporary artists engage with ideas, materials, and forms through conceptual practices, symbolization acts as the mind's conceptual process at work. If all goes well, loss can become a catalyst for symbolic activity, enabling both students and teachers to internalize and learn from the losses we endure. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We now have Paula Borquez to discuss the digital commonplace book, Reframing Reading as a Practice of Implication.
Thank you. I think that's good, right? Yeah? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So, while listening yesterday to the lovely 5-minute presentations that were, in most cases, emerging from engagements with one sentence from Britzman's work, I had a bit of a revelation. Suzanne Lumen was quoting extensively from Britzman's paper on the writing block and discussing a bit this kind of like the desire to influence as one of those forces that could potentially prevent us from writing. And so I began to think, which teacher does not want to influence their students? It is essential to what we do. And so today I'm going to kind of like engage in a bit of wishful thinking in framing this presentation and my work on the Commonplace book, which is itself an investigation on the question of influence as a sublimation of my own desire to influence my students. And that means to create a space or the pedagogical conditions where the spark of a single sentence can ignite a long-sustaining passion. And in saying that, I can be present in the moment when I was 22 years old, a student of psychology, encountering Paul Ricoeur's Freud and the Interpretation of Culture, and knowing right there and then that psychoanalysis was going to be my passion. Okay, so in thinking a little bit or in presenting this digital commonplace book pedagogy, I want to engage 3 registers of this practice. One is thinking of the commonplace book as a thinking space, as a method of invention, and as a practicing of reading. The commonplace book is a particular reading practice, very much associated with writing, or is kind of like reading as a form of writing and writing as a form of reading. It is a literary technology and an archival genre in which practitioners select, copy, amalgamate, juxtapose, link together, and annotate reading materials into an ever-expanding corpus. Okay, so in thinking about the commonplace book as a space, we have the humble and mighty notebook. We can see here Benjamin's notes on Baudelaire. And obviously the notebook is the most traditional space in which commonplace bookkeeping has happened. On the right, we see the beautiful design of Vincent Placius of the Scrinium Literatum, which is a kind of like a wooden computer in the 17th century in which the slips of paper, the notes, could be moved around this particular machine. So it would, in a way, counter the rigidity potentially or the linear ordering of the notebook. So this is one, let's say, innovation. Each of these spaces, thinking spaces, has obviously limitations and affordances, so they are not great or bad. It depends on how is it that you are deploying these particular spaces. In my course, students design or assemble a digital commonplace book in, I don't know, I want to call it a program, which is like a knowledge management system that is called Obsidian. The advantage of Obsidian over other note-taking methods is that Obsidian does not only allow students to organize materials in folders or through tags, but explicitly to create links and counterlinks between the notes. These links can take, obviously, various forms, but part of the, let's say, theoretical underpinnings of thinking in this way is thinking rhizomatically, yeah? And so the capacity to create links between notes and to avoid the silos and the arborescent thinking that is hierarchical and that, it's part of it's part of what I'm looking for in using Obsidian.
Sorry, so this switches out.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes. Okay, and that's... Okay, good. So it's interesting. I just found this out yesterday that this rhizomatic form of writing that is very much about collecting the already said, collecting received discourse, is similar in its intentions, or at least in its ethos, with Barth's understanding of writerly text, in which we are looking at the multiplication and heterogeneity and contradictions that emerge as you are building these ever-expanding corpus, numerous nodes of signification that mean more than one thing. It's a construction that is non-sequential. There's no transcendental signifier. The information can be organized at different moments under a particular signifier. It can be entered at any point. And replaces product and structure with process and multiple segmentation. So again, all this to say that the digital commonplace book has particular affordances. Okay. I don't know where to start here. Well, I already mentioned the notebook and the fact that the notebook has been traditionally understood. It's an extension of, it's understood as a beehive in the sense that you can use the commonplace book to organize and assemble the information, but it's an extension of a long metaphor of the reader as bee, yeah, that I'm going to be elaborating a little bit on later on. One of the things that is really important about, exclusive in a way to commonplace book practices, is that self-writing, and this is Foucault's understanding in his exploration of self-writing in Stoic philosophers, is that this self-writing has nothing to do with the technologies of confession, has nothing to do with disclosing the self, with revealing your secrets or digging deeper in, but on the contrary, to capture the already said, and to collect what one has managed to hear or read, and for a purpose that is nothing less than the shaping of the self. So it is a completely, in a way, outward oriented process, not inward but outward. In that sense, okay, I'm coming, okay, I'm going to say that later on. In the sense that when I understand the commonplace book as an autopoietic practice, what I mean to is that really the space or the space, one of the privileged spaces where this transformation or this is going to happen is in the interiority of the reader. Yeah. And so it's kind of like this, what the way Seneca writes it, I think is beautiful, which is kind of like, he said, there's a mysterious alchemy in which the discourse transfigurates into flesh and blood. And so that is basically at the bottom, yes, we have these material spaces, that is the commonplace book as a material record of this collection, but what you're actually looking for is this self-transformation that you can predict. It's intentional in the sense that you engage intentionally in a practice, but you cannot predict what's going to come out of this particular practice. Okay. So I'm thinking of, okay, we talked a little bit about how the commonplace is a thinking space. Now we're going to think about how is it a method of invention. And here we need to kind of like think a little bit about how we tend to think in present times of invention as creativity, as your original voice, but in thinking of invention from a rhetorical point of view, invention is one of the 5 canons of rhetoric. It was not really about innovation or creativity. It was actually, all these ideas are really inherited to us from 18th century articulations of genius, prodigious creative power, but they are not part of this more classical understanding of invention. And so basically the idea in invention was that you would assemble an inventory that was large and diverse enough from which you could draw forth or call or retrieve the discourses that would fit the kairotic demands of the rhetorical situation. That means speaking to a particular context, an audience, and a purpose. So you would make use of this big assemblage to bring out in the precise moment or in the kairotic moment those resources. So that is what actually was understood really by invention. One of the things that interests me about commonplace bookkeeping is how it counters what Peter Stalivras calls the regimes of originality that are so dominant in composition pedagogies and also in our practices when we are asking students, write an original essay. That is, the expectation is that there's some originality that are going to emerge in that process. And I imagine I'm not the only one who has not received that many original essays. But there's this pressure put on the student to produce an original thought that is very much kind of like mobilized through these regimes of originality that we tend to all kind of like dwell in. And so in turning our attention to reading as that kind of like the set of relationships with your reading that have made you as a writer or as a speaker or as a writer, in thinking of reading not as a passive process of reception, but as a process of invention, and in investigating explicitly in the practice of commonplace book the question of influence, we are much closer to understanding how is it that this repetitive or mimetic practices could actually bring out innovation. I'm also interested, and in this sense I'm conversing with Sarah Ahmed, I'm also interested in how the very practice of commonplace bookkeeping challenges ideas of intellectual property, ownership, creativity, inspiration, and all those ideas that, again, students dwell in all the time, and it's a big source of anxiety for students. Before I move to the next, I want to bring attention to this paradox that Foucault outlines in studying the upomnemata, which he articulates as how could one be brought together with oneself with the help of a timeless discourse accepted almost everywhere? And so in a way, I'm echoing that kind of paradox in thinking about the relationship between repetition and innovation in commonplace book practices. Okay. I think we're in the thicket of it, just to quote Deborah. Okay, so as I said, I am interested in mining this question or this paradox of how is it that you can come closer to yourself by, no, this really? Okay. Okay, so in a way, I'm kind of like, again, mining the Lessian principle that actually difference can only emerge from repetition. And this countering my own, psychoanalytic formation that tells me that repetition is actually the most immanent attribute of the symptom. Like the symptom is definitely characterized by repetition that creates this extimacy, which is something that I recognize as completely intimate to myself and simultaneously completely foreign, mechanical and outside of me. So I'm kind of like trying to think about these two things together. I believe, as Deborah's lovely quote indicates, that you can get away from repetition compulsion, that you need to use repetition compulsion, harness repetition compulsion, instead of trying to overcome what cannot be overcome, really. And so it's kind of like, okay, what aspects or how is it that you can harness repetition as a process in which the new can emerge or difference can emerge? Okay. Maybe what I can do very fast is to say that there's 3 dimensions. Let me see if, no, not this. Okay, there's very fast, there are 3 ways in which repetition courts innovation. The one and most obvious is through copying and transcription. You are actually copying the text. I actually ask my students not to use copy and paste, but to actually transcribe the quotations that they are putting into their commonplace book. I'm not sure they do it, but that's my expectation. But what is interesting is that in something that feels so mechanical, the very selecting and lifting of the quotations and putting them in the context of whatever, you put them alongside another quotation from another person, you are producing unexpected conjunctions, conceptual gestalts, logical leaps. And this very process transforms the field of differential relations where these transcribed texts already mean and signify. And that in itself is actually the students themselves are surprised at how that produces, as the students are also working, because basically the only instruction I tell my students is you're just creating the seams between these quotations. Don't give me an essay, please don't. Just work on the seams. What are the relations that are linking these materials together? A second way in which repetition harnesses invention in the commonplace book process is through the workflow, which I borrowed from sociologist Niklas Luhmann. He actually used this very workflow in writing his 72 books. And I can't explain the movement between fleeting notes, literature notes, and permanent notes, but it is not really a linear process. It's actually 3 different modes of note-taking and moments of engaging and arranging the text. And the students go back between these modes to create their commonplace book. In this workflow is inherently a recursive practice. It is a practice of folding the text over itself over and over again, rather than moving forward in a linear progression. I'm not a baker, but I found that there's a baking process in which when you're kneading the dough for making bread, there's a method that is called the stretch and fold method. And I think that's the perfect metaphor for what it is that you're doing with your text as you're moving through this workflow. I should take up baking, I suppose. The last way in which repetition harnesses invention is obviously through the sustained and long-standing practice of commonplace bookkeeping, which, as I mentioned before, transubstantiates receive discourse into flesh and blood. In Erasmus' articulation, and maybe I have to stop there, which is the most beautiful I've read, of the metaphor of the reader as bee, he writes, what bees bring back is not honey to start with. They turn it into liquid by the action of their mouths and digestive organs, and having transformed it into themselves, they then bring it forth from themselves, which is the most beautiful articulation of that which comes out of you as that which is the difference in innovation. It comes out of your own flesh, the own transformation of yourself in the process of commonplace bookkeeping. I have to stop now? Yeah? Okay. I am borrowing heavily from Antonia Pond's work on practicing, in which she's reading or theorizing practicing in conversation with Deleuze's difference and repetition. And I find some of her concepts really useful to articulate some of the tensions that the commonplace book may bring forth. One of which is the fact that practicing is a repertoire of intentional and recursive practices that actually both give a stability and a steadiness to the subject, but simultaneously, quote, they intend that which we cannot foresee. There's also a tension between the cultivation of the self, the folding of that interiority, that is simultaneously a desedimentation and an attenuation of the self in the becoming absorbed and in the giving into the rhythms of the practice in which you kind of disappear. A long-standing practice means that you are kind of like giving yourself over, surrendering, and you disappear in the rhythms of that practice. That also suggests an interesting tension between activity or intentionality and passivity. And it's also obviously a way to access indirectly, but also concretely and strategically, this is Pond's words, the operations of being and becoming. Now I have to go? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Borquez. And now we have Janet L. Miller and Patty Lather to walk us through the Camp Brits. So thank you so much.
The what?
Camp Brits. Camp Brits.
That name comes from camp theory, which Janet was a big part of inciting at the Bergamo Curriculum Theory Conference one year, and they had T-shirts or sweatshirts that said Camp Theory. At Banff. It was at Banff, yeah. So we're here to do Camp Brits. Our methodology was drinking wine, going over the indexes of our books to see where we had cited Deborah. And then we talked about that. And then we told funny stories we could remember from our times with Deborah. And so that's what we'll be presenting here today, is a combination of how her work influenced our work and whatever funny stories we can remember from almost 40 years. We're going to start with how we met Deborah. We're going to go back and forth. I'll tell my very short story of meeting Deborah, and then Janet will tell a longer one. My short story is that Deborah and I disagree on when this happened. Deborah thinks we met at AERA in about 1987, American Educational Research Association, huge conference for those of you not familiar with it. And I was Deborah's guide through the bathrooms. In 1987, there wasn't much of a sense of Deborah at AERA, and there had been some uncomfortable moments. And so I remember us going arm in arm into the bathrooms. So I was her accompany person. I think we met at Fred Erickson's Qualitative Research Conference. somewhere around that same time in Philadelphia. He had a qualitative conference every other year, if I remember right. And you were at Binghamton. When did you leave Binghamton?
92.
Okay, well, that would, somewhere in there. It was, I think, and then you had me come to Binghamton and give a talk.
Yes.
Yeah, do you remember what year that was?
Binghamton is a vague as it should be.
So let's just say 87 to 92, somewhere in there. 85. Oh, okay. Very good. All right, now Janet's going to tell her longer story.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me? Is this on? Because I don't have a large voice. So these are rhizome thoughts and feminist memories. And I'm going to do a kind of trailing, pretty rhizomatic depiction of it. Deb and I probably met in the late 1980s, we think. My first memory of actually seeing her in person was when she picked me up at the Syracuse airport. She was at Binghamton still. I was in New York City, and picked me up at the Syracuse airport. And we were headed toward our colleague Magda Lewis's home in Kingston, Ontario, where she was pulling together a group of us to talk about curriculum, pedagogy, critical theory, critical pedagogy, and it was going to be a pajama party that lasted the weekend. So, yes, there were a lot of discussions there, right? So that's my very first meeting of you personally, I think. But we had been talking on the phone for quite a while, and we had kind of probably brushed past each other, I think in probably the early, like 1990 kind of thing. Your Practice Makes Practice was published in 1991 originally, and then revised 2003. My first book was published in 1990, and both of our books were published by State University of New York Press, SUNY. Our managing editor for both of our books, unbeknownst to each other, was an incredible editor. You would be so lucky to have this woman editing your whatever you wanted to put forth, Lois Patton. And I think Deborah and I agree we owe Lois a great deal of thanks for how she guided us in our first book productions, but also stayed absolutely attached to both of us in terms of our careers as we moved zigzaggingly. I wouldn't say forward so much, but yeah, zigzag is good. So it was a propitious weekend at Magda Lewis's home, I think. There were amazing discussions going on through the whole weekend around not just critical pedagogies, but what are we as educators really trying to do here? And I thank both of our presenters who appeared before us, because I think you raised intriguing questions about what it means to unlearn, to even supervise student teachers, for goodness sake. I mean, so thank you. So conversations like that. When Deborah and I were talking about our first books, because they were published before we really actually met each other in person, I was very much influenced. I think my doctorate was about 8 years ahead of yours in terms of chronology. And so I had been in my original teaching assignments, having to supervise student teachers and work with them. I didn't do that for very long because my workload at Teachers College was primarily doctoral students. But in that short time that I was working with student teachers, I was drawn. I must have read Practice Makes Practice about 10 times the 91 version, because that's where I was, the time element. And in the United States, I think we both were deeply affected by the 60s, the 1960s women's movement, civil rights movement, and heaven knows we're going to have to do it all over again right now. And so that really had a tremendous influence on how I was imagining teaching and learning. And then practice is opening up all kinds of questions for me in terms of how I would be working with my student teachers. But it was so infused for me by the 60s, and so infused with refusals that I learned very quickly in those protest movements, refusals of neoliberal intrusions into teaching and learning, which in the United States, do you have here in Canada, what's that called? EDTPA? Do teacher educators know what I mean? Okay. Well, it's this absolutely abhorrent thing put out by Stanford University, where student teachers have to be evaluated on like 8,500, criteria, and the university supervising people have no say in the evaluation of their own student teachers. So it's a huge checklist. It is beyond neoliberal intrusions. So I go back to Deborah's original practice makes practice. So many times, even in thinking about that, not only working through that, and after we met in our conversations at Magda's house, I think I even got more attached to the original version, just given what I was having to do in the moment there. And I think the reason I clung to it, I think perhaps a little too much, was that it was critical pedagogy, as the way you framed it within that book, it held open a promise for praxis. It held open, that was a promise. We had to figure out how to do that. But, the promise was thinking could be in dialogic relation, where concerns for being and becoming were brought to how people understood and confronted our conditions, and where were the potentials for self and social transformation. Pedagogy then, according to Deb, is inherently unstable, susceptible to failure in each and every moment. And conflicts of emotional life are really what I have not ever been able to loosen in my thinking. It's just there for me. So I thank you for that. I think we talked a lot about that on the ride from Syracuse Airport to Magda's house. So that's a very long exposition about how I first met Deborah. A turning point in my life, I would say. Yeah.
Did you want to say anything more about practice makes practice and the question of belief in your teaching?
Well, I think what I wanted to say is that in some ways it's a haunting for me. It's a haunting. I think perhaps working with doctoral students allowed me to think, oh, I'm through the haunting phase, which is ridiculous, of course, right? There's no phase. But it haunts me in the sense of pedagogy is inherently susceptible to failure each and every moment. And every night when I walked out of Teachers College and headed back across Amsterdam Avenue, I was more dwelling in the failure than I was in any of those moments when something does happen that's like a clicking moment when you're teaching, and it's like, this is perfect. Well, not really. So that's how it haunting in a good way, in the sense of constantly reminding me that what I think is going to be a fantastic insight for my doctoral students and blah, 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 blah. Or even in advising doctoral students, which is its own agony in terms of the reading of dissertations, the commenting on the dissertations, the writing, what we just heard in actually both of our presentations this morning. I come back to, pedagogy inherently unstable, susceptible to failure. And I think that's what kept me going for so long. Yeah.
I'm going to stand up. Microphone, please. Okay. Deborah was a Marxist when I met her, and so was John. And moved into post, and I don't know, post, and wherever it is we are now, we don't even care to name it so much, but it's been a wonderful journey that we've taken kind of simultaneously. And I want to just start out in terms of how she's influenced my work, or the indexicality of it all, by thanking you so much for helping Getting Lost get published with SUNY. I had kind of given up. I just could not find a publisher. And Deborah took me in hand and got me in her series, and all of a sudden it started moving. And I love that book so much. I would have just been devastated to not get it out in the world. So there's one very material thank you. Now, in terms of the indexical, what I did was just take down all the thoughts that were circulating through my work that came, in a way, it's the quotes. So certainly difficult knowledge, which I wanted to ask Alice, weren't you the first author on that?
Oh, that's its own story.
That's its own story? I mean, I always think of that as Pitt and Britzman. And that's what it is.
That's a key paper, but Deborah had been working on the concept of difficulty.
Uh-huh.
I was the co-PI.
Ah.
A very junior scholar.
Okay.
At York with Deborah on that short grant.
Who needed every publication she could get.
Yeah, who needed every publication, and honestly, that's its own story.
Okay, well, when we...
Writing in those days was not nearly as valued.
That's the truth too, yeah. All right, well, anyway, difficult knowledge certainly shows up in my work. Thoughts awaiting thinkers. I always liked that one. I mulled over that. I found my reading of Deborah to be very much, not psychoanalytically between the lines so much, as a mulling. I would read and reread, and then I would mull. And then I would, who was it that talked about Walter Benjamin? Yeah, through over quite a bit of time now, I've been reading quite a bit of Walter Benjamin, and I somehow put him in juxtaposition with Deborah, and that was my mulling place. But thoughts awaiting thinkers, and then one that I've used over and over again is the too soon. And I particularly use that with my students when they're trying to write and publish. And I say, oh, darling, it's just too soon. And that is Deborah's famous line. And I quote her, I give her credit all the time. The too soon, which is remarkably useful with students to help them, the whole turn your dissertation into a book pressure. I found if you just wait a couple years and read some more and take the feedback you got into account and redo it and make it less dissertatey and more reader-friendly book, everybody benefits from it, including you. So the too soon was enormously helpful. And then one of my favorite phrases, which actually came from one of my doctoral students, Lisa Weems, a psychoanalysis we can bear to learn from. You know, as a former Marxist, and who knows what I was at the time, but psychoanalysis was not exactly up my alley. And I was not going to read Freud. It was some feminist thing, I think. And talk about resistance. Oh, my goodness. But I couldn't resist Deborah, So all the Freud I got was via Deborah. And that I could bear to learn from Freud under those conditions of Deborah. So a psychoanalysis we can bear to learn from was the name of a book review that Lisa Weems and I wrote about, I think it was Lost Subjects, if my memory serves me right, and published it in Ed Researcher. So it got some distribution. The need to be wounded by thought as an ethical move. I did a project on women and AIDS, HIV/AIDS, in the early 90s, and that was a life-altering sort of study. And again, Deborah was very important in helping me not only think my way into it and feel my way into it, but somehow to survive it. And not just survive, but flourish within the context of that. Talk about difficult knowledge, yeah. You know, at that time, AIDS there was no treatment or cure really for it. And so you're dealing with people who are facing pretty dark times. And trying to figure out how to be a researcher in that context with any kind of ethicality. I went to Deborah over and over again trying to situate myself in the context of that study. But the need to be wounded by thought as an ethical move was sort of something I hung on to in the doing there. How theory hurts our feelings. I loved that one. And I particularly loved it in my teaching because I was hurting my students' feelings all the time. They felt dizzy, and how do they make decisions in their lives, and rugs being jerked from underneath them, and theory hurts your feelings was part of the show there. What kinds of practices are possible once vulnerability, ambiguity, and doubt are admitted? And that has been very useful too in terms of whatever my own inventions might be in the name of methodology, bringing the vulnerability, the ambiguity, and the doubt to the front of it all helped me think myself into practices that made sense in the context of the empirical work I was engaged in. And then one that came out of the AERA 94 panel, it was kind of a mega panel called But Is It Research? The big stars were Elliot Eisner and Howard Gardner. Deborah and I were on the panel along with 4 or 5 other people, but we didn't matter. It was the 2 big guns that were the show. And they went at each other about whether the novel could be a dissertation, I remember, they went at it a lot. And then as it ended, I think Bob Donmore was running the show, and he asked a question for each of us. What was our wish for educational research at the end of this mega panel? It was in one of those rooms where you're up on a high dais, and the room was full, a huge room full of people. And Deborah's quote, Deborah's wish for educational research: "My wish is that educational research becomes increasingly unintelligible to itself." I'm going to read that over again. My wish is that educational research becomes increasingly unintelligible to itself. That was 1994. That was another one of those. I mulled over that baby quite a bit. But I realized somewhere along the line that was like the best possible wish that one could have for educational research in 1994. And I think Deborah and the crew she was hanging with at that time helped make that dream come true in some ways, because I think, and AERA, if you look back and see how AERA itself has changed and become friendlier to the kind of work that, I don't know about psychoanalysis, but qualitative research for sure. I did a little study one time of just where did qualitative research come into AERA and how long did it take for it to be a real presence there? And at a certain point, it practically took over. I mean, it's huge there now. So, all right, the shift, another big one for me was the shift from the real of ethnography, which I was very caught up in, to the effect of the discourses of the real. And that must have been when we were reading Foucault and trying to figure out what all that meant. But that sounds sort of simple when you listen to it, but it was like this. and all of a sudden your work went like this, and you could almost feel it. The shift from the real of ethnography to the effect of discourses of the real. And then here's another one. The aim of a less heroic space versus salvation narratives more typical of critical work, to be disabused of much, evoking a thought that can think against itself, engaging with the abject in our work where we ruin other people's knowledges. That's a little long and there's lots going on in there, but that's in some of my, I think that's actually what would you call it? A synthesis of several quotes from you that I have in one of my pieces. And finally, to hold doubt and not knowing as seasoned knowledge, where we embrace our discomfort and mourn our losses, including the sublime of our certainties in all its exhaustions and tired repetitions. I hung on to that one quite a bit too. To hold doubt and not knowing as seasoned knowledge. I really like that idea of seasoned knowledge, where we embrace our discomfort and mourn our losses, including the sublime of our certainties in all its exhaustions and tired repetitions. So in sum, you made me smarter, and then you helped me make my students smarter. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Now Janet's going to talk about Maxine Greene and Deborah.
Before that, I'm going to talk about, in terms of that haunting that I mentioned, in terms of practice makes practice. At the same time that Deborah and I had met and then had enjoyed discussions, mostly over the phone, about our first books, that had emerged within a year of each other, we also wanted to get together, and that happened not just at the Syracuse airport, but also happened when Maxine Greene, U.S. philosopher of education, had a book festival for Practice Makes Practice, and I was there in Maxine's apartment, which is across the street. It's still there. It's not Maxine's anymore, but across the street from the Guggenheim is how you identified the location, on the third floor of that apartment building. And that evening, our publisher from SUNY, Lois Patton, the person I had mentioned before, was there also. The three of us started talking sort of in a corner of Maxine's living room about a possible book series that Deborah and I could co-edit. And we talked with Lois about that. And then we were able to turn around pretty quickly based on that conversation at Maxine's apartment, celebrating your book, pretty much quickly turned around a proposal. And we did co-edit that series called Identities in the Classroom, again, trying to pay attention to conflicts in stuck places and impossible knowings of emotional life in classrooms was really going to be, the framing for the kinds of books that we would be looking for. So we did that I think I was with you for 6 years on that endeavor, and we were able to publish, I think, 5 very fine books. Deborah still edits that book series, by the way. I dropped out just given my work as managing editor of JCT, Journal of Curriculum Theorizing, and also co-director of the Bergamo Curriculum Theory Conferences. 2 things that Bill Pinar and I had started in the mid-'70s. And Bill Pinar sends his greetings to all of you this morning. So that book series, in a way that helped me even go deeper into Deborah's work, was a way of us, one, just simply talking on the phone constantly And it became a ritual, it became a pattern that deeply influenced my teaching, my work with my doctoral students, my life, and in ways that I've really thought about this in ways that I'm not quite able to even speak of. It goes that deep for me. I also want to talk a little bit about Deborah's and my interesting connection, and it is interesting because it wouldn't be automatic, I think, but the fact of our attachments both of us have to Maxine Greene, and not just to her work, but her life and being a part of her life in differing ways over the years. And in the early beginnings of this book series, we were editing, as well as, the ideas around critical theory that were first presented by Deborah in ways she thought about it in Practice Makes Practice. Maxine, also interestingly enough, even though she was an avowed and never changed her mind, she's a existential phenomenologist, and that's it, and she doesn't care if you like that or not. That's it. However, she would talk about critical pedagogy. And so here's what I think drew Deborah and me into our discussions even further. So Greene situates critical pedagogy as a problem of the future, experienced in the present. I think of us returning to the United States on Sunday, so I'll just say that again. I don't want to dwell on it, but it's there. Critical pedagogy, Greene insisted, has yet to be made, but will culminate not in our finding its proper object, but through developing our capacity to search. Maxine really, because of the existential phenomenological position that she always took on everything, she worried, much like her hero Sartre, she worried about questions of freedom, and she argued for a way that could hold tensions in particular relations to one another, and as being able to produce possibilities for movement, possibilities for acting together in one way or another. She never named the actual possibilities for action that we should take. That was up to us to figure out. She did, however, remind us over and over again that her favorite decade in the United States was the 1960s. And so, in a way, that was her mantra, She loved the 1960s. She loved standing on the steps of Columbia University and the protests. And she loved when they marched through the halls of Teachers College with kazoos, protesting. In so many ways, that's kind of a visceral, bodily sense that I have of Maxine's influence on certainly my thinking. And I think, to a great extent, Deborah also. And so it's an interesting connection for me to muse and wonder about still, even though Maxine is no longer with us. She is in her writing. She is in her, you can go on YouTube and hear her talk if you've never heard her speak before. And she is in ways that I think, I can trace, certainly in my work over the years, but also in yours, Deborah, and how deep that influence has become for both of us. Deborah helps me think about, in relation to Maxine then, a particular conundrum that I'm really wrestling with, and the presentations this morning have really helped me think about this, so I thank you both so much. Also, Maxine asked me, I don't remember how many years ago, if I would write her biography. Right. So I said, well, why would I do that? Why would you want me to do that? And there's there's just a way in which I, in some, I think, unpredictable ways, was able to. I was lucky because I was at Teachers College, and I was in the same intellectual context, where she had taught her almost her whole career. And I know members of her family, and I know all of those things, and I maybe know too much, and I know way too little. And the idea of even thinking to attempt to do that has had me stuck now for
A long time.
a long time. Yeah, a long time. Would you write the biography of Maxine Greene?
If I was sitting on what you're sitting on, yeah.
I know, I
And
know.
tapes where they co-interviewed each other.
Well, there is something about roosting, there's something about really letting it sort of permeate me so that for a long time now, right. So, and so Deborah, again, you're writing and you're thinking and you're talking with me about that, and like, what are you waiting for, right? Why not? Why not? But it's not just my hesitations in knowing, the impossibility of representing anyone, frankly, not just Maxine Greene, right? That's what we work with all the time. But it's like, all right, so this will be my take on it, and that will all it will be. That will be all it can be. It's just my take on it. And you would be appalled to see I have 3 years of tape recordings of conversations with Maxine. I met Maxine in one of the early pre-Bergamo conferences at University of Virginia, where she spoke also. I heard her speak for the first time in 1973 at University of Rochester, where I was doing my master's degree with Bill Pinar. So it's a long history in terms of being very familiar with her work, having read perhaps not all of it. You would just not believe. It's sort of like Deborah. You would not believe how many publications Deborah has beyond her books. Many people have mentioned this, journal articles. Maxine the same way. It's humongous. So this could be my take on it. And I think I can get started. Thank you.
Oh, I don't mean to be bossy, but that could happen.
I know.
Janet is the best situated person in the world to write the biography, the official biography of Maxine Greene. And I was just thinking in an emergent kind of way, why don't you two co-author it?
Okay, wait a minute. Could I say something about that?
Please.
Well, just at a moment when Deborah's letting go of a few things.
Uh-huh.
Just-
Oh, okay.
Adding new projects.
Okay. That's all right. It was
That's
just a
what I've been
thought.
saying for about 10 years, so I
A
don't.
thought I thunk. And because the two of you are very caught up in that. Yeah, let go. Okay. Anyways, funny stories. Well, I've already, in a way, told the cruising AERA stories, which went on for many years. And it wasn't just bathrooms, it was also parties. Deborah had a little social shyness, I guess you could call it, at the front end, and I didn't. And I used to love those big parties in those big rooms that were just wall-to-wall people, and she would be out there going like this. And again, we went arm in arm and cruised many of those parties and had a pretty good time, as I remember. And then another memory is, this would also be AERA. Deborah and Alice recommended a hotel to us when AERA was in New Orleans. And so we did. We got a room and everything. We went in there and there was a used condom on the bed. So we haven't taken their recommendations for hotels too seriously since then. Although otherwise, as I remember, it was a fine hotel. Thirdly, I want to just thank, in a way, the gracious hosting that I myself have experienced with both Deborah and Alice. You quoted Derrida's hospitality without reserve, and oh my, I have been such a beneficiary of that. Every visit I've ever made to Toronto has included some version of your hospitality without reserve, and it means a lot. Finally, there is a memory, an image in my mind of Deborah being at Bergamo and Alice, and Barbara and John had rented a car and driven from Toronto to Dayton, Ohio. And they were going back, and the rental car wouldn't start. A new rental car had to be bought out. They bought out a Lincoln Continental. And it was a foggy morning taken off for Toronto. And Deborah's short. The Lincoln Continental was quite large. And here's little tiny Deborah driving. We're saying goodbye out in front of Bergamo, and little tiny Deborah driving that big old car taken off for Toronto. So it's just somehow unforgettable. It was all kind of gray, as I remember, but you got home safe, so hey. The afterlife of her work, in terms of it serving as an index of cultural political currents, is clearly not just whatever afterlife means in terms of posthumous. It's happening right now. You can look at this room. You can see what it means for a lifetime of scholarly work to bring psychoanalysis to education, and we are all so thankful. Mm-hmm.
You two should stay right here. Oh, go ahead.
Deborah dropped me off from the Syracuse airport, for me to fly back. It was a raging snowstorm. And so I said, please call me when you get home. And I said, how was it? And she gave me this image. She said, I was driving like this going, I want to live. I want to live.
Thank you both. I have on my organizing hat. I could listen to this for a long time. I would like to suggest that we extend 15 minutes, have lunch at 11:45, so we have a chance to have a discussion. So I'd invite the presenters from earlier in the panel to come on up, and Suad, you'll take questions. So thanks very much.
Alrighty, so we're now open for Q&A. Does anyone want to go first? No pressure. Yes, at the back.
Yeah. Hi, Karen. I loved your paper. I identified completely with being a supervisor, where I would say at a loss, trying your best to be gentle and kind, saying all those good things, and then the whole thing backfires. Just amazing paper. I wonder what happens if we think about loss not as a loss of something or someone, but of being at a loss. And I wonder if attention is played more at the sense of being at a loss and tolerating being at a loss, whether that shifts the sort of conversation a little bit, because being at a loss is, in a way, at a core of a loss. But I also think it's at a core of learning and pedagogy. And I think it's not recognized enough, the way that being at a loss is at the core of how we learn. So it's a conversation. So I'm asking for, yeah.
Yeah, I think so too, Jonathan. Thank you though for that framing. I especially since the pandemic, this experience that we all went through in very different ways and were affected differently, but all affected. And there really haven't been forums to talk about what just happened. What does it mean and how do we go forward? I've been really interested in how we think about loss in the conventional sense, like someone died or I went through a breakup or whatever, which is part of all human experience. But also exactly the way you're describing, being at a loss, because I think we're at a loss much of the time in learning. The story that I described from student teaching is in many ways emblematic. There are lots of meltdowns in student teaching, and they come when you least expect them. Sometimes it's the faculty having meltdowns too. And they're not necessarily about a loss in the external world, right? In the case of the student, I mean, what was so astonishing about her second telling was that she could acknowledge she'd lost something she thought she'd learned and needed to learn it again. And I understand that as a loss as well. That's where Deborah's concept of human incompleteness is so useful, because, my own incompleteness was very much part of that picture. What I couldn't see or notice or really attend to in that moment because of what I was so focused on is really a touchstone, I think, when you're doing human-facing work, because that's always going to happen. But we don't always realize that it's happening, and we don't always recognize those opportunities that come later to do the second telling, to do the thinking around it. And that's where the hot mess circle, that and I do want to say that's I have two wonderful colleagues, Jim Garrett at University of Georgia at Athens and Brian Casemore at George Washington University in DC, and we talk a lot about teacher preparation, and we've talked a lot about using those kinds of pedagogical structures that allow people to get together and talk in an open-ended way, but to also really think about what does it mean, what's happened. And part of the hot mess that I didn't mention because of time constraints was that someone needed to take notes and someone was responsible for describing. And then we had another column that was about what do we think it means. And then we had an advice column because we can't help ourselves, right? Especially in teacher education. So every time someone said advice, we'd put it in that column. And then we'd kind of look at all those, we had all this amazing documentation, and I can't say the students loved it, but they were willing to humor me. And we did that all semester long. And there was a lot of movement where I think a lot of us, not just that student, but many of us were struggling with stuckness. How do we go forward from here?
Thank you.
I have a question for Paula. Thank you for that wonderful paper. In light of this conversation of loss, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the experience of loss that students have practicing this folding, reading, and repetition. The image that sticks out for me is when you make them responsible to articulate the seams between the quotes and whether there's an experience of loss there.
Thank you. It's going to take me a while to think of that process in terms of loss. There is a loss, definitely. What I could say is that students are really anxious, particularly before they submit the flitting notes, because it doesn't matter how much you explain or give examples or show the work of other students, they don't understand what it means to create those seams. They think it's more than what they are already doing when they think. So there's a lot of anxiety. And some students, I would say, an active rejection of the course. Like, why don't you tell us what to do? And so that is a very difficult part. I try to preempt that with, it's going to be a bit chaotic. You're gonna go down rabbit holes that you never thought you would, and that's going to, like, you may not fully understand what you're doing. So I would, if I were to think in terms of loss, I would say that they become perhaps aware of how much they've interiorized the form of the essay. And that is the salvation. You know, if I could only say this essay will claim, then, you know, like I would be fine, yeah? One of the things that I didn't explore further is Peter Elbow's notion of the believing game, although he says something that I think is very much related to this, and he says that the itch for argument is the itch for closure. And so that in coming to an argument, in coming to agreeing or disagreeing with what you read, you finally get over it. And so in some way, this pedagogy is about extending that dwelling in the sentence or in the text in that moment of undecidability in a way. So holding the tension and the loss of certainty. You may not fully understand what this means before you jump to your own claim, and also be generous in reading. So yeah, not sure I addressed your question fully, but.
Time for one more question. One more question.
Deborah.
It's not so much a question. First of all, thank you, everyone. It's just so beautiful to be sitting here and listening to very different viewpoints on education and influence. So it's not quite a question, it's what you think about this idea. And that is that there's something about education that's spectacularly absurd. And that's where we work. I don't think we necessarily work in loss. Think about Sanlos and the student teacher bursting into tears. I think about trying to write Maxine Green's autobiography. I think about trying to think about loss and Patty Lather's work. I think about the digital humanities. But we're working under a structure that is absolutely senseless, absurd, persecutory, and senseless. Did I say senseless? Senseless. And so no matter how much we try, the people are coming with us into this classroom of absurdity. And so I wonder if part of your methods, as I'm listening to you, is to knock on that door of absurdity as a methodology, and then see what happens. What happens? Meltdowns, writing blocks. I hate your class, and the symptom, as you say. So I wonder if you want to say something about like how crazy, insane, the structure of education is that we work from, whether it's in AERA or the classroom or supervision.
Well, I'll just say, I'm just so glad I've been retired for 10 years. Because I think it's getting crazier to the point of, I don't know what I would have done. So I'm so sorry for people who are, especially the ones just going in, because what do they know? And it's got to be like 5 times harder than the hard was for us. And that's at the professorial level as well as, beginning teachers.
Thank you, everyone. A big round of applause for all of our panelists.